couple of minutes to come on in. There's still folks trickling in and joining us. But Kiki, have to respect the comm badge there. It's really good. I am, as you know, all caught up on the lower decks. And while we're just sitting here doing this, can we talk about New Trek for a minute?
We better talk about New Trek, yes. Mm-hmm.
This is important. So of Discovery, Picard, and now Lower Decks, the comedy, cartoon, office show, office-based comedy set in the Star Trek universe. What's your jam right now? What's making you happy?
Well, right now, Lower Decks is providing the new episodes that I need in my life. So I really, really love it, and I didn't expect to. I thought that it was going to be the Muppet Show reboot, it would be well-intentioned and probably pretty well written, but that it wouldn't really catch on. And I'm really glad that the opposite has happened. It's the exact kind of Trek that I was waiting for. Picard and Discovery are great, but they are part of this epic fabric. Everything has to be brought back into something that people are calling canon, which I don't really like for lots of reasons. I don't like when people start talking about canon as if it's the only thing that anybody can tell stories from.
Right.
And with Lower Decks, what you have is a universe that I recognize, but it's a different story every week, and it's situational, and that's what I like about it.
Yeah, I agree. Like when Picard happened, I was like, oh, I had not expected myself to have such a strong emotional reaction to having new Captain Picard in my life. That was very important to me. But it quickly became something that felt very much like we are, we are building a long form dark narrative, and I didn't need more darkness in my life, and I'm sure.
No, and it's also to me, the familiarity of the characters, it's so emotional for me to see Captain Picard again and the other characters from Next Generation that they've brought back, that it's my emotions are just
I'm already raw.
Yeah, or I could be crying at any moment, in Picard, and then there's this very dramatic story that's being told. It's a lot on me, you know what I mean? It's it takes a lot of energy to follow everything and be invested, which I totally am. But with Lower Decks, I can enjoy the antics and it's literal hijinks, which
100%
I want. Yeah.
And what you were saying about sort of canonicity as well, I think there's something so restrictive and sort of aggressive about a world in which you have to tie everything back to canon, and everything has to be sort of in line with this sort of collectively imagined, but not really collectively, a very small set of people are doing this imagining set of rules. And one of the things that I agree is fun about a cartoon Star Trek is they get to do crazy things like beat up the ship all the time in a way that would have been impossible if it were a real set and not just a cartoon. So anyway, this is good. This was excellent vamping for 5 minutes about Star Trek.
Yeah.
Great about it. This has set the right tone. I think that I will continue admitting people as they trickle in, but we have hit a nice critical mass, and so I'm inclined to kick us off.
Yeah, this is great.
So, hello everyone who isn't just me and Kiki Petrosino talking for a bit about Star Trek. Welcome to the first virtual Wells College Visiting Writers Series event, which is kicking off the fall 2020 series. This reading, like all of our events, is made possible by the generous support of the New York State Council for the Arts, and we are grateful for them, as always. I am Dan Rosenberg. I'm the director of the Visiting Writers Series at Wells, and I'm so excited to be welcoming Kiki Petrosino back for another event. She was one of the first readers I brought to Wells back in 2015, and of course, I wish we could be in Macmillan Hall right now, just eating an unreasonable amount of cheese. But the silver lining to the pandemic is that we can welcome people from a much broader community to this event. And I'm excited to see and to have touched base with people from far and wide who are joining us tonight. And I'm very glad that you're here, so welcome. And here's how tonight's gonna work. After my little intro right now, Kiki is going to read from her new book, White Blood, A Lyric of Virginia. You'll all be muted, but there is a chat option in Zoom, and you should feel free to ask questions in the chat. And I might jump in between poems to pose your questions to Kiki. After all, this is a live event, not a recording, so if you want to respond to specific pieces or something comes to mind that you think others might want to hear from Kiki about, please go ahead and ask it in the chat. And then at the end of the reading, there'll be time for a more formal Q&A. And during that time, you can continue to write questions into the chat if you'd like for me to read on your behalf, or you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question yourself. And hopefully that procedure will keep all of this orderly and sane. And when it doesn't, I just ask for your patience and forgiveness because we are new to this. Hi, Celeste. And so now it is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce Kiki Petrosino. White Blood is her fourth book of poems, and it was listed as a new and noteworthy book in the New York Times. It was included in Publishers Weekly's anti-racist poetry reading list, and it's been met with acclaim already, including a starred review in PW, which is a big deal in the publishing world. It was also a Millions must-read poetry pick when it came out in May 2020. Petrosino has received a fellowship in creative writing from the National Endowment for the Arts and an Al Smith Fellowship Award from the Kentucky Arts Council. Her work has appeared in Poetry, Best American Poetry, The Nation, The New York Times, and many, many more. She's a professor of poetry at the University of Virginia, where she also earned her bachelor's degree before going on to the University of Chicago and the Iowa Writers Workshop. Are you impressed yet? You should be. Kiki is a big deal. She's also someone whose two cats allow her to live with them, someone who grew up, in her own words, lonely and deeply nerdy in the suburbs, someone who is as excited about a Monster of the Week style new Star Trek series as I am. Kiki Petrosino is complicated, as we all are, but she has marshaled that complexity into a poetics that is completely distinctive. It's brilliant but approachable. It's engaged with tradition in a very broad way and always mindful of where those traditions come from. Her relationship to history, to those traditions, to identity, genealogy, and her intellectual and familial roots in Virginia all intersect in this new book. And one of the things that strikes me most strongly about it is how honest it is. Even when she's writing villanelles or sonnets or triolets, some of the most artificial of forms, there's a living, breathing human embodied in her words. Someone curious and anxious, happy and hungry, capable of reaching dizzying rhetorical heights and then announcing an unabashed love for gift shop trinkets. Petrosino's radical honesty is rooted, I think, in her willingness to admit to being more than one thing. In our current moment, when nuance is often not on the menu for many discussions, her cup overfloweth. She's one of my favorite human beings and one of my favorite poets, and that combination is awfully hard to come by. And you will hear why right now. So I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful Kiki Petrosino.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for not only for that introduction, but for being such a great friend and for looking at this manuscript before it was published and giving me your thoughts on it, as I have done for you, and which I will always be happy to do. Those of you who are students in the creative writing program at Wells, take good note of who is in your classes with you and who reads your poems and looks forward to seeing your poems every week, because in the future, when you are working on your own poem outside of an academic environment, it's those friends like Dan and like me who will be happy to see the little paperclip icon on your email screen, indicating that you've sent an attachment of new poems. You know, you want to find the people who will be celebrating that moment in their email box, of which, you know, our email boxes overflow, especially now. And so to get new poems from a friend, that's really what we all want. So thank you, Dan. So I'm going to read some poems from my latest book, which as Dan said, is called White Blood, A Lyric of Virginia. And before I do that, I can tell you a little bit about how I began working on this book. I started for personal reasons. In April of 2015, my grandmother, Cleopatra Smith Beverly, passed away just 46 days shy of her 100th birthday. And she was my last remaining living grandparent. And with her loss, I realized that I had entered into a special stage of adulthood, which is, you know, it happens to everyone, but it's a profound realization to realize that an entire generation of your family has now passed into the beyond, and you now don't have access to the stories and memories of that person as they could be delivered to you directly in a conversation. You can't have a conversation anymore as we do on this terrestrial plane. And so I wanted to write some poems in which I contemplated my grandmother's life and her legacy, which was really special and very influential on our family. But I also wanted to do a little bit of research in a documentary or archival vein and think about the connections that my mother's family and my grandmother's family have to the Commonwealth of Virginia. Many of my ancestors, effectively all my ancestors on the African-American side of my family, originated in North, you know, as far as their North American history, they trace roots back to Virginia, and particularly to Northern and Central Virginia, where I am now. So I started looking into that genealogy, and that led to writing poems, not just about my grandmother, but about the very process of seeking this information and being on this journey. Prelude. You're on a train and your ancestors are in the quiet car. The quiet car is locked with a password you can't decrypt. You're a professional password decryptor, but your ancestors are demolition experts. You're wearing black tactical gear, and your ancestors are wearing black tactical gear. You're dashing through each compartment, slamming doors open, while your ancestors lay small explosives. As the heat expands within the carriage, you escape through a picture window. You climb to the top of the train, and your ancestors rappel down the sides. You're rappelling down one side of the train when you glimpse your ancestors above you. They leap from carriage to carriage as if weightless, as if drifting, as if curling tongues of snow. You cling to the side of the train as each of your ancestors lifts away from you. They float into the cloud of themselves. In the rushing light, you perceive them as hundreds of slow snake doctors. Oh, you begin. What your results mean. Western Africa, 28%. The West African you is a hunter. Try, carry this. The West African you has split and expanded, a mixture historic as a gene. The West African component of your lineage, the out of Africa event, the New World slave seen in this genetic print. You are likely a mixture, a cluster, a high number. Your DNA has roots that cluster and spread and trade and carry. The West African you spanning more than more regions of time in people. Oh. Between this cluster and this cluster, an African, oh, Niger, and chat. Oh, fingerprint. African, you span most of Africa, African America, African diaspora, and the southern African forests out of Africa, east, south, and then southeast, within Africa, throughout Africa, the historic African world. Well, so, well, so. Maybe I'll stop there and ask and see if Dan has any additions, any thoughts here.
Well, I actually am glad you wanted to pause there because I had a question, which is this poem that you just read, can we see that one on the page, is exactly what I was going to say, Shiloh. This is what this looks like roughly, right? These are erasure poems, a sequence of 10 erasure poems out of, according to the note in the back of the book, a sort of DNA genealogy test kit results, right?
Yes.
And one of the questions I wanted to ask is, as you know, there are many ways that people can do erasure poems where, you know, they either preserve the formatting of the original or not, or they keep the originals in like gray type behind the black words that they're preserving or not, or they'll bear the evidence of their erasure in some way, like Mary Ruefle does whiteout, or like Phillips is a humulent, he paints over the words that he doesn't want to keep, that sort of thing. Why did you choose to do it this way, which seems to suggest a sort of preservation of the original location of the words on the page?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, the most immediate answer is that I had just finished teaching Ronald Johnson's Radios, which is his very important, like, major erasure of the first 4 books of Paradise Lost. And in fact, you know, the title Radios, some people pronounce it radios, but it has a lot of, the erasure creates this ambiguity, right? Or we don't really know how to even pronounce it anymore. And what Johnson did in the 80s was he took the verse from Milton, he erased, created his poem out of the positive and negative space rendered in the erasure, but he preserved the original positions of the words as they had appeared, as they had been composed by Milton. So that served my purpose because I wanted to preserve the gaps and silences, or create a sense of gap and silence in the negative space of my erasure. As I was writing these poems, it seemed like the poems started to resemble the DNA double helix, you know, like they kind of laddered their way like across different pages. And so as I was composing this on the computer, what I did was I took the little paragraph they give you in your DNA kit that says, oh, you're 28% West African. That means your ancestors came from here and they traveled across here. I took that paragraph and copy pasted it 10 times. And then I did the erasure process 10 times, 10 separate times, to create each section of that poem.
Wow, that's very cool. And Emma asked a sort of follow-up question, thinking about maybe what you just said about wanting to preserve the gaps there. What is the relationship between the erasure poem form and the quiet car setting in the Prelude? Mm-hmm. Did you think about those as connected?
Yeah, I do think about them as connected, and they're connected because of quietness and silence. You know, I told you that it was through the bereavement, you know, the loss of my grandmother, and realizing that I was left, everything that I wanted her to tell me, I had to have already asked already, right? Like, and I did do that. I did get to hear my grandmother's story while she was living, but I wouldn't be able, she was now silent as far as like follow-up questions, you know? So, you know, what shall we do with that? And I also perceived, as I pursued certain kinds of information about my African-American ancestors, that certain information had not been preserved in the historical record. And some of those silences were because of the oppression they suffered, but other silences were, I think, intentional on their part. So for example, in the oral history of my family, they never passed down. I don't know the names of the white families that owned, but I say that held my ancestors on their property. My family never passed those names down. Now, as a researcher, I see that as a missing piece of information that I want to know. But if you're the ancestor, you're probably thinking, why do you need to know? That's not as important as our names and what we're giving you, you know? So the research process began to feel as though I was chasing information, and the ancestors were sometimes blowing up the train before I could get to them to ask, you know?
That's fascinating, and a subject that you sort of tackle directly in a poem sort of later in the book, right? One of the Message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County poems,
Yeah.
actually tangles with that directly and asks a question at the end that feels maybe even more like prescient given when you compose this poem versus our current moment.
For sure. Maybe I'll read a couple of those Free Smith poems.
Please do.
This section of the book is called Louisa, which is the name of the county and town where my grandmother's family and her ancestors all come from. Message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County. You want to know who owned us and where, but when you type, your searches return no results. Bondage was grown folks' business, then old folks. We saw no reason to hum old master's name to our grandchildren or point out his overgrown gates, but you want to know who owned us and where we got free. You keep typing our names into oblongs of digital white. You plant a Unicode tree and climb up into grown folks' business. You know old folks don't want you rummaging here, so you pile sweet jam in your prettiest dish. You light candles and pray, tell me who owned you and where I might find your graves. Little child, we're at rest in the acres we purchased. Those days of bondage were old folks' business. The grown folks buried us deep. Only a few of our names survive. We left you this sudden glints in the grass. The rest is grown folks' business, we say. Yet you keep asking, who owned us? And here's another one. Message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County. You ask why we didn't register as required, why we failed to appear before the provost marshal, why we avoided the courthouse, the census, the bank. You ask where we sheltered while battles seethed, where our mothers gave birth, in which hidden houses, and why we didn't register as required. While so many perished in other counties, or raged with Nat in Southampton, how did we manage? We avoided the courthouse, the census, the bank. Whatever we had, we held. Whatever we knew, we told no one who counted. We kept back our names. We didn't register as required. When you search for us now, you find silence. You may trace us back to a moment, no further. We avoided the courthouse, the census, the bank with its clock, tracking everyone's time but our own. We chose inward passages. We kept deep counsel. We didn't register as required, which disappoints you. Why do you trust the courthouse, the census, the bank?
That's wonderful. When I read that poem on my own, I read that last line much more accusatorially than you just did. I hear it as like, why do you trust the courthouse?
Yeah.
Maybe speaks to my sense of our current moment a little bit more.
No, like it's like not a great feeling that this poem has become more relevant. I was really trying to write about the time during Reconstruction when the federal government was trying to reintegrate the former Confederate states back into the Union. And the government knew, the federal government knew that all these newly freed Black people were going to be very vulnerable to different kinds of dangers, from just like straight up predation in terms of like, contracts being drawn up and not honored, not being paid for their labor, not being able to have food, clothing, like a job in the towns where they lived. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was created, and it would set up an office in pretty much every town in every county of the former Confederacy. And there was an office, a provost marshal's office for the Freedmen's Bureau that existed in Louisa. And anybody, like Black and white people, could go there. For example, if they wanted help in drawing up a contract for labor, or helping somebody file papers at the courthouse, or if they were looking for family members who they knew had been sold further south, sometimes the Freedmen's Bureau would be able to help. And then there was also the Freedmen's Bank, which was established as kind of part of the Freedmen's Bureau's work, where free African American people could be able to have a bank account for the very first time. Now, all of that is awesome. However, many, many, many newly freed people didn't really go down to the provost marshal. And some of it was because and this was in the records from Louisa County, some of it was because the white people in town would tell them, if you go to the provost marshal, they'll send you away south, and we want you to be near us so that we can take care of you, right? So that would keep some of them away. And then other people were just like afraid to go to the government for any reason, you know? So even though one ancestor's name does appear in the Freedmen's Bureau records, it's not an exhaustive listing of who lived anywhere at any given time, because some people deliberately didn't want to make themselves known to the government in that way. So I guess I'll continue reading. I'll read, you know what, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson for a little bit. I'm gonna go to a section called Albemarle. And Albemarle County is the county where I am currently zooming from. It's in central Virginia. It is the home of the University of Virginia, which Thomas Jefferson founded in 1819. And it's also the site of Monticello, which of course is Jefferson's famous home on the mountain. Instructions for time travel. You must go through, Mr. Jefferson, along his row of chinaberry trees, behind the ruined smokehouse, in unmarked tracts under field stones, with no carvings, no monuments, with a few leaves shadowing the mulch, near scattered weeds in sunken lines, while the sun walks in the day, at the end of the day, in an oval of brushed earth, just as the soft path finishes, under branches where the dead are always saying what they always say, right about me. If you tell them Sally Hemings was 3/4 white, they'll ask how dark she looked. When you compare her memory to an earthen porringer brimming with late sun, they'll say, fetch that porringer now. They'll make you fill it up with rain so they can regard themselves. You'll watch them swerve their visages. As they regard themselves, they might mark a thing or two. They'll probably mark a thing or two which makes them shiver. But how'd you say she looked? They'll ask, patting their foreheads. Not like you, since you're twice as black. Of course, that's not quite right, but as you open your mouth to speak, you'll catch them watching too close. You'll want to fix a drink then. You'll drink. They'll probably get sleepy. Tell us what you know about Sally, they'll yawn, not sensing how that story swells under your tongue, a sweet. Remember, sweet, how it dissolves their boot prints from the drive. Now try your own green lungs, like this, like this. There's many a slip. La cuisine bourgeoise. Mr. Jefferson loved early green peas almost as much as I love complaining. I pick at his recipes and their French alphabets larded in light. We know Mr. Jefferson loved early, green peas almost translucent and gone by July. Didn't the French believe delight and temperance merry in the mouth? I'll hold my peace. As much as I love complaining, I pick at the recipes Mr. Jefferson loved, early green peas almost. And I'll read two more from this section and then maybe talk a little bit. Terrorem. Every night I go back to Mr. Jefferson's place, searching still his kitchens, behind staircases, in a patch of shade somewhere, beside his joinery, and within his small ice house, till I get down that pit lined with straw, where Mr. Jefferson once stacked frozen slabs of river water until summer. Then visitors would come to him to ask about a peculiar green star or help him open up his maps. They'd kneel together on the floor among his books, lavish hunks of ice melting like the preserved tears of some antique mammal who must have wept to leave Albemarle, just as I wept when I landed in Milan for the first time. Stone City, where Mr. Jefferson began to learn the science of ice houses, how you dig into the dark flank of the land, how you seal the cavity. Leave open just one small hatch through which I might lift through gratings Mr. Jefferson's cold-dressed victuals, his expensive butter and salads, the sealed jars sweating clear gems of condensation, white blood appearing from warm air, as if air could break and slough, revealing the curved arc of our shared Milan. There I wore silver rings on each thumb. I studied and spoke in fine houses of ice. I knew a kind of crying which sealed me to such realms for good. Old magic weep, old throb in throat. How much of my fondness for any place is water stilled and bound to darkness? The shop at Monticello. I am a black body in this commonwealth which turned black bodies into money. Now I have money to spend on little trinkets to remind me of this fact. I'm a money machine, and my body constitutes the commonwealth. I spend and spend in order to support this. I support this mountain with my black money, strange mountain in late bloom, strange mansion built on mountains of wealth. I spend so much I'm late for the tour, where I'm a blooming black dollar sign. I look good in the dome room, prowling its high-gloss floor. It's common to desire such flooring for my own home, but owning a home is still strange. My blackness makes strange tools for a living, rakes the strangeness like dirt. I like to rake my hands over merchandise, bayberry votives, English hyssop, and crisp sachets. I like this engraved pewter bookmark so much suddenly I line up for it, clenching my upright fist. I pay cash to prove myself no shoplifter. Still, I abscond with my black feelings, crisp toast points dunked in fig jam. On one hand, I must think very highly of myself to come here. Then again, that sounds like something I would say.
Those are great, and I will remind folks that they should feel free to put questions in the chat there. And while people are maybe thinking about that, I thought, Kiki, I would like to ask you a little bit about some of the forms that you write in. Like we read the messages from the Louisa section, message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County, are villanelles that break some of the rules of villanelles, but are very decidedly in conversation with that form, right?
Yeah.
And,
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, if you have things to say from that prompt, go for it.
Yeah. Well, I don't, okay, so Dan and I met in Iowa where we were both getting our MFAs in poetry. And at the time that I was studying in Iowa, I did not write in any of these fixed forms. There was always like one person who was working on sonnets, and I felt that I couldn't relate to what was going on in those poems. I really wanted to write. I just wrote free verse because I thought that that was the most natural thing to do as a contemporary poet. and that by writing in free verse, I was becoming more tuned into some sort of natural modality for like poetic utterance or something in America. I really liked prose poems. I liked how they would turn with every sentence. But I didn't really want to write sonnets, villanelles. I didn't even know what a triolet was. So like, you know, it wasn't something that was focused upon, right? So it took many years really to think about what my relationship could be to fixed forms. The whole time that I wasn't writing any of those kind of traditional formal poems, I was teaching them really enthusiastically, like all the Elizabeth Bishop sestinas, like all of the sonnet sequences I had studied as an undergraduate student. I would take great pleasure in introducing to students that moment in Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo and Juliet like make a sonnet in their first conversation, right? And how that like embeds the sonnet into the middle of the play. I was like so happy to show students that for the first time. But really, it was in writing my last two books that I thought more consciously about actually bringing some of those forms into my own work. And I did it in service of something that I already loved, which was repetition and incantation, which I learned as an undergraduate from my professor, Gregory Orr, is a huge component of the lyric. The lyric like as a concept, one of the ways of creating a raft of language, which is the image that Gregory Orr uses, the raft of language that we weave together to get us over hard times, is woven together a lot of times through repetition, through creating like a habitat of language that the reader can step on and be supported throughout the poem. And I really like forms that ask you to alternate entire lines. So that's why I'm really into the villanelle, or at least I have been for 2 books worth, and why something like a triolet might appeal,
Yeah, that's. I was going to say as you were talking about that even your earlier poems that you were writing in Iowa were so sonically dense that it seems like a very small step to go from them to sort of patterning those repetitions in that way. But I was struck, particularly in your last 2 books, but this one in particular, with the relationship between how those forms also have their roots in not just Europe, but Italy specifically, and thinking about these straightforward interrogations into your sort of familial history and the various sort of identities that that comprise your identity. And I know that you've studied Italian in undergrad, right? And like the Italian part of your heritage is also important to you. And I found myself thinking while rereading this collection about what it might mean for someone with your particular heritage to be deploying these forms with their roots in an Italian poetic tradition, and a larger sort of Anglo-European tradition, to interrogate the African-American side of your family, yeah. Right? It seemed like a really interesting and fraught space to be working in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily think of it as fraught. I think it as like a celebratory space. I was an English major in college, and then I minored in Italian, and I studied in Florence. My own family comes from quite a bit further south than Florence, on the ankle of the boot, in a little hilltop village. And so I was able to see those cousins and meet them and speak Italian when I was living in Europe. I lived in Switzerland, in the Italian speaking part of Switzerland. I worked at a boarding school right after undergrad. So the Italian language is always like super present and very important to me. My understanding of the sonnet is really enriched by my ability to read those old sonnets by Petrarch and like Guido Cavalcanti, Guido Guinizelli, like all these cool guys. To read them in the Italian is even more of like a sort of a wonderfully complex experience to have. But I was also super interested in things like the villanelle, which come from like a French, the sort of like troubadour situation, and even the sonnet comes originally, I think the real tea on the sonnet is that it's comes from the Occitan poets, right? And that then the Italians adapted it from the French court into a kind of an urban vernacular. Like this is what Florence is, you know. And then the English people like Wyatt brought it to England, but then brought it back into the courtly environment. You know, so there's like all this interplay and everything. But for this particular book, I also wanted to bring in some French because Jefferson was the minister to France. He was heavily interested in French food, French wine. You know, like all the like trappings of Monticello. A lot of them are French. There are specific cookbooks that are in French that we know that the family used, and there was this like back and forth, like this intense cultural exchange between specifically Monticello and Paris, you know? So I really wanted to think about like what relationship originally like French form could have in a section of poems where I was talking about Jefferson in particular.
Cool. And that is a beautiful segue to a question from Courtney, or perhaps Courtney's family. And they ask, while researching for and writing these poems, how much did visiting locations like Monticello or having tangible experiences as part of your research influence you?
A lot. This has been a very hard 6 months because I'm trying to work on new poems and continue my research to explore another branch of my Afro-Virginian family. And I cannot go like anywhere, in part because many things are closed. And then on the other hand, I'm also trying to make a bubble with my own household between me and my husband and not take any like non-essential trips, right? But for this book, I went to Monticello as a tourist probably 5 or 6 times. And y'all, I paid full price to get up that mountain, okay? Okay, so Monticello is run by a private foundation. It's not like National Park Service or anything like that. You know, you could go to the Lee family mansion at Arlington and just like cruise on in because that's a National Park Service site. But Monticello is a private foundation. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They are charging that admission. So I paid like a bunch of money to go there, but every time I would step like onto the property and begin that touristic experience, I experienced like joy. Like it's a place where I feel like there's so much beauty and there's so much to behold that I'm transported by being there, but I also feel really weird about it. I feel weird about how expensive it is. I feel weird about how I'm always one of only a few tourists of color there. I feel weird about the things that I overhear in the gift shop from people who just went on a tour and seem to have understood not everything about what was going on in terms of race on that particular mountain, you know? I also am reminded when I'm on the mountain that just the next county over, right? The very next county over is Louisa County, which is where my ancestors were. And they were there alive, and they were enslaved people during the entire time that Jefferson is writing and dreaming and thinking about all that America can be, you know? So it's that confluence that I wanted to experience in a physical way. And by going to those places, it was just huge for me.
That's fantastic. And we have one more question maybe before we turn back to some poems. This is from my colleague, Tara, who asks, do you see a relationship between these fixed forms that we were just talking about? And maybe I can sort of expand that into thinking about like your interest in the architecture of Monticello and the absence of history that you were discussing earlier, structures or frameworks for that which is elusive or missing. That's the idea that,
you know, what's really, really interesting about the architecture that Jefferson favored and helped propagate throughout Virginia is this neoclassical architecture, which is a lot about measured areas of openings and enclosure. I mean, if you think about, I mean, for me, the central grounds of the University of Virginia is iconic. I know that it is, you know, nationally as well. But for me, I think about that lawn, which is, you know, headed by the rotunda, by Jefferson's rotunda, which is an example that architects from all over the world have looked at in terms of its scale and its proportion. It has that beautiful dome, and it has like white columns. And then on either side of the lawn, you have a colonnade, which is where the students would live. And there are pavilions that are set perfectly symmetrically, and that's where the faculty would live. And then there were terraces where the faculty were supposed to be able to cross from one pavilion to the other one so they could exchange ideas, right? So it was like super cool. But they also created these things called the serpentine walls that would enclose the faculty gardens. And within those gardens, it wasn't just a beautiful like patio or whatever, which is what I would use it for. The garden is where the enslaved women would do the laundry and be making repairs, right? So the whole thing about UVA as a campus is that it was a place that professed and announced itself by means of the architecture to be very open and be a place where like the students could interact with faculty and faculty could interact with other faculty in these very like supposedly open but kind of choreographed ways. And then that choreography didn't suddenly stop with like, you know, the enslaved workers who were literally built the place and were helping it to run. So when you walk around, you think about the fact that there were women doing laundry, there were enslaved men taking care of the horses, right? There were people carrying messages. There were students who would come to UVA with an enslaved person with them to serve them, right? As they were getting an education. So the whole idea of opening and closing, what is included and what is excluded, is just part of what really fascinates me about this, about Jefferson and about UVA in particular.
that's fantastic. And do you see that playing out in your relationship to sort of traditional forms in that way as well? I'm thinking about the tension between the prescriptive mode of those forms, the way that like often people who are introduced to the form think these are the rules and I have to do this. If it's going to be a villanelle, it has to rhyme, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, but that's where I can be delightfully American. And like, I can say, this is a villanelle, everybody. But I've just broken like, you know, a handful of the rules of villanelle. Maybe I don't follow the metrical patterning that is required of an English language villanelle, right? Or in the sonnet, maybe I am not doing the end rhyme that would be required of either an English or an Italian sonnet. So I see something that's a rule, but I also see an opening, right? I also see a place where I can make some kind of an intervention, you know, especially for the purposes of commenting on, right? On commenting on the silences, on the like incomplete information, on the contradictions, on the double standards, like on the things that are implicit but not always announced, you know?
That's fantastic. Could you give us a couple more poems?
Sure. So I guess I'll read a couple more poems based on my research in Louisa County, and then I'll end with the last poem in the book. Okay. In Louisa. You wake up because you hear someone sing. little lamb, as if the singer were calling from across a great distance. You know, as you've always known, that you're the little lamb in this song, just as you know that no matter how far you may wander from the loop of sand where you were born, the singer of this particular song will always sing little lamb, meaning you, quite distinctly. As you slowly climb from the covers, you try to tell the song to stop that noise, please. But what comes out is play it again, which you hadn't meant to say at all. Soon, the song starts up once more, spinning the long journey of itself. It speaks of coiling into thickets of sharp weeds, of slanting across hills. The song even describes you in some time before remembrance. You wore a suit of woven water and learned to speak in rippling syllables. You or someone like you. A Guide to the Louisa County Free Negro and Slave Records, 1770 to 1865. The first box is for all the good white men, the ones who freed their slaves on Christmas. It's always Christmas in the first box, the day Delpha shall go out, the day Viney shall go out. These good white men only desire the guardian care of those under age. After that, they shall go out, just as Winnie shall go out at the age of 21, entirely free from me or mine or any other person whatsoever. Delpha, Viney, and Winnie shall go out on Christmas Day. The first box slides open to show their certificates. The good white men of this county, believing that all men are by nature equally free, have left many of these. One certificate is for Viney, one for Winnie, one for Delpha. These good white men can only free the slaves they truly own. One man observes, the above-mentioned Negroes are disputed in their titles to me, namely Delpha, Viney, and Winnie. He doesn't say more about the dispute. He doesn't say what happens on Christmas Day. This good white man has said all three should go out precisely on Christmas Day, but now it is different. It's very different now, even though Christmas has come. The good white man writes, I only free as to my right and title given under my hand. The box slides open to show certificate after certificate. It's Christmas. Louisa County Patrol Claims, 1770 to 1863. I pry open the files, still packed with liquor and strange brine. Midnight seeps from the cracks, slow pulp of arithmetic. 4 or 5 or 6 at a time, the white men draw along the Gordonsville Road on foot or on horseback, clustered close. Each man counting up his hours, the knife of each man's tongue at the hinge of his own mouth. For 93 years, and every time I slip away to read, those white men line the roadway, secreting themselves in the night air, feeding and breathing in their private column. Why, belly up to their pay stubs, scraping my teeth on the chipped flat of each page. This dim drink only blights me, but I do it. Okay, and then the last poem of the book, Psalm. Dear Lord, dear high remembrancer, dear providential love, have mercy. Have mercy, thou surveyor of wild flowers, assessor of royal and exquisite bee realms. Have mercy, ledger, who tracks us in the night, who measures without speaking our dark trespasses. For nothing here survives, not the gold-legged deer browsing the bleached office park at dawn, nor the minute finch on her branch of long division, but thou absorb it all. O gazer, be kind in thy absorbing calculus. Won't be long before thy reckoning curve arrives at the junction of our error. How, beneath thy mineral eye, we walk abroad, forgetting thee, cartographer of sparrows.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Kiki.
Yeah.
I love that ending. That's so good. um, and I think we have hit the point in the evening. I see a question from Vale already, but I would invite anyone who wants to ask their own question. They can use the raise your hand feature, and I will call on you and unmute you when the time comes for that. But Vale's question can kick us off, which is, what goes into your decision to write a poem in the second person?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it came from a sensitivity that I had around speaking in the voices of these ancestors who are departed. And I even include, like, I mean, my people that I knew, like if I were going to write about my grandmother, I'm not sure that it would feel comfortable for me to write as I in that kind of a poem. And I've been thinking about this because in speaking with other poets about this, some international poets that I know, some of them are like, what? Why wouldn't you use the tool, one of the major tools of poetry, which is persona, to get at some of these voices? Like, why wouldn't you, why would you wall that off from your practice and not use it much? And I've thought about that for a long time. And I just feel that for this particular book, it's super tempting in the face of incomplete information to allow the imagination to fill in the gaps. And my imagination as a poet could create a voice that I could be pleased with as an artistic intervention into something. But I feel like I don't want to insert myself. I don't always want to speak as I. There's plenty of times when I do, and I think that it's important to have a lyric sensibility that you can voice as I. But when I'm talking about from the ancestors' point of view, I'd rather use we, so that I feel that it's more of a collective, yet very mysterious, like almost otherworldly voice speaking. I would rather speak to a you, a second person, when I want to get at something, when I want to point the reader to something. Maybe I could be speaking as much to the reader as to anyone else in the poem. It's also, in my view, not as commonly used, the second person, as I can be. And I just want to I just wanted to try out like different forms of address that were not the go-to forms of address that I would normally use for other projects, you know?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I am reminded of like Laurie Moore's use of the second person in the short stories in Self-Help in particular, where that you is a sort of thinly veiled I, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the speaker sort of talking to herself in a lot of those, and that performance of distance reads so often as a kind of protection, a kind of like grasping for safety from which to speak about something.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel a similar sense here, that there's like a speaker in peril will erect that type of very, very visible artifice, not to actually hide themselves, but to sort of show an anxiety around the vulnerability of the subject matter, maybe.
Yeah. And also to talk about the fact that my particular journey through this genealogy and through this history is just one of many, many, many journeys that people are on. And it can feel as though you're in a video game where you're playing a character who finds out this information and then like goes down, you know, like one of those text video games where it's like, go down the stairs to the basement, and you go down, your character goes down there, and then it says like, look behind the painting. And like, you know, I felt very much as though the search and the journey that I'm on has these predetermined components to it, that like, if you're going to start working in Black genealogy, then you need to go to the 1870 census, because that's the first census where Black people were counted as citizens. And then you measure as far back as you can from that census, and then you measure as far forward as you can from that census. Like, that's literally like a play manual from a video game, you know? So in that sense, the second person really fits in better than any first person I could imagine.
Absolutely. That is great. Thanks, Jeff. Just a wonderful reading and conversation. It is indeed such a treat to talk with you, Kiki. And maybe it is a little bit after 8, so barring a sudden raised hand over here, I might just ask you as my final question, what you're working on now? What are some new Kiki when are some new Kiki poems coming together? Do they feel of a part with the project that you've been working toward, or do they feel like you're pivoting towards something new? What's coming up next for you?
I'm working on 2 things at the same time. One of them is going to be like a memoir. Prose sentences are somehow going to come out of my brain. As you can see, I'm a little bit terrified at the idea of writing a memoir, but I'm going to do it. It's going to be putting together some essays about this, about what it's like to claim / reclaim this Virginia heritage, and like it's going to be a little bit about like my own identity as a Black American of interracial ancestry. Like, what does all that mean? I'm also working on a collection of poems that are going to talk about another branch of my African American Virginian family. So even though the 2 works are going to be using different forms, the research materials actually really parallel, you know. And as soon as it's like safe to go to the places that I want to go, I actually have particular areas of Virginia, particular cemeteries and churches and places that I'm going to go visit as part of that work. So it's very much focused on Virginia right now.
Very cool. That is exciting. I love your sort of panic about prose, because as you were reading the prose poem, actually, A Guide to the Louisa County Free Negro and Slave Records, 1770 to 1865, one of the things that felt really present to me was rhetorically, though this is in prose, rhetorically it feels very much like a sonnet. You've got the turn at about the right spot. You've got like, it is structured in a way that that is familiar from a poetic standpoint, despite being like insistently a block of prose.
Yep. Yeah.
But in my humble opinion, I think that makes some of the best prose. So I think that'll be great. Well, thank you so much, Kiki, and we're seeing a lot of thanks from everyone in the chat. And thank you all for joining us tonight for this first reading. I really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful night. Stay safe. And we will hopefully see you all back soon for the next Visiting Writers event, which you will hear about wherever you heard about this one. Good night, everyone.
Night.